When the doctor gave me the diagnosis, I didn't cry. I called my son. He didn't answer. Later, he texted, "Swamped at work." Then, silence. I wasn't asking for much, just a little attention. One visit, but he disappeared, as if I were the illness. I sat for a long time, staring at the jewelry box I had saved for him. Then I realized it should go to those who value not bloodlines, but warmth, support, and presence. That was the beginning of my true choice. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Mary Ellis. I was 74 years old and had spent most of my life working as a nurse in a hospital in Milwaukee. For 38 years, I tended to patients, changing dressings, holding hands, whispering comfort in sterile rooms. I was good at it. It gave me purpose, routine, and a way to feel useful in a world that often forgot people like me. After retirement, the silence hit me harder than I expected. No more rushing to check vitals. No more early morning shifts. No more charting or late night coffee in break rooms. Just me, my house, and the long stretch of quiet that came with it. My home was small but tidy. A little white house with green shutters and a front porch that creaked when you stepped onto it. I had a garden that bloomed in spring and struggled in the winter, and a dog named Teddy who never strayed too far from my side. Teddy was old, like me. His eyes had gone cloudy, and he slept most of the day, but he still wagged his tail when I whispered his name. We understood each other, two creatures worn soft by time, comforted by routine. I woke up that morning the way I always did, at 6:30, with light spilling through the thin curtains of my bedroom. The kettle whistled as I poured myself a cup of tea. Then I sat by the window and looked at the quiet street outside, the same street I had lived on for more than 40 years. Nothing much changed anymore. The mailman came at 9 The woman across the road walked her little dog in a pink sweater. The air smelled faintly of dry leaves and something distant, like smoke or maybe time. There were photo frames on the windowsill. My husband Peter, who passed 10 years ago. My son Greg, who now lived in Denver. I hadn't seen him in a long while, not since his last business trip brought him near Milwaukee, and even then he hadn't stopped by. But I kept his picture there, smiling in a graduation cap. He used to be so close to me. We used to eat cereal at the kitchen table together, laughing over the comics section. That boy felt so far away now, grown, married, busy. I tried not to think about it too much. I told myself that distance was part of life, that children grow and move on. But the ache stayed, like an old bruise that never fully healed. I checked my plants. The peace lily needed water. The African violets were starting to bloom again. I hummed as I worked, the soft sounds echoing in the stillness of the house. There was comfort in these rituals, even if no one saw them. They made me feel real, like I still existed in the world in some small, meaningful way. Later, I folded laundry, sheets that smelled of lavender, towels worn thin but clean. I placed them in their designated spots, making sure every corner was neat. Everything in my house had its place. It gave me a sense of control, a sense that even if the world outside no longer called for me, I still had this space, this structure. Around noon, I made myself a sandwich and ate it on the porch. The sun was warm but not harsh, and I could feel it on my hands, the way light touches old skin, gently, respectfully. Teddy dozed beside me, his breathing slow and steady. I watched a single leaf float down from the maple tree and land at my feet. The silence around me felt vast but familiar. Not lonely exactly, just still. Sometimes I imagined what it would be like if Greg came by. I'd bake his favorite lemon pie, dust off the good plates, pull out the blue napkins we used on holidays. I imagined us sitting on the porch, drinking iced tea, talking like we used to. But those were just thoughts. He was always too busy, always somewhere else. I told myself he cared deep down. He had a lot on his plate, important things, important people. That afternoon, I received a call from my doctor's office, a follow-up from last week's checkup. I made a note to call them back. The voice on the machine was calm, but something about the tone lingered in the room after the message ended. I didn't rush to return the call. I poured myself another cup of tea and watched the steam rise. I'd call them later. I didn't want to interrupt the quiet. By evening, the sky turned golden. I lit a candle, just one, and placed it on the coffee table. It was the same scent Peter used to like, vanilla and cedar. I sat in my armchair and opened the book I had been reading, but my eyes drifted often. The words blurred. My thoughts wandered. The room was full of small noises. The ticking clock, Teddy's breath, the hum of the refrigerator. They were the sounds of life, simple, steady, unremarkable. But they were mine. That night, I fell asleep with the window slightly open. The breeze carried in the faint smell of dry leaves and chimney smoke. I pulled the quilt up to my chin and closed my eyes. There was no one to say good night to, no one waiting for me in the next room. But I was not afraid. I had grown used to this silence. It wrapped around me like a second skin. And as I drifted off, I told myself that tomorrow would be just another quiet morning, and that was enough. I didn't expect the floor to disappear beneath my feet like that. One moment I was reaching for the sugar canister in the kitchen, and the next, everything tilted. The counter swayed away from me, and my knees folded like they no longer belonged to me. I didn't hit the ground hard. It was more like a slide, a slow, sinking collapse into the linoleum that left me breathless and stunned. I remember looking at the ceiling tiles, wondering why they seemed so far away. The ambulance came quietly, not with sirens, not with drama. Just two young paramedics who moved like they'd seen this kind of thing too many times. One of them helped me up. The other asked me questions I barely processed. I answered what I could, slurring a little around the edges. My vision came and went, and my head pulsed with a strange, hollow ache. I remember Teddy barking from the back door, panicked and sharp, and I remember reaching for him but missing. Then the straps, then the stretcher, then nothing for a while. The hospital smelled like it always did, antiseptic, sharp, and cold. They wheeled me through a blur of fluorescent lights and muffled announcements. I was conscious again, but detached, like I was watching myself from somewhere above. A nurse tucked a blanket around my feet. A doctor with tired eyes explained something, but his words floated past me. Tests, blood work, scans. I nodded when it seemed appropriate. I didn't ask questions. I think part of me already knew. They admitted me to a room that felt like every other hospital room I'd ever been in, except this time I was on the other side. I wasn't the nurse anymore. I was the patient. The bed had mechanical buttons I couldn't get used to. The walls were beige, indifferent. A television hung in the corner, playing news I didn't care about. But what I noticed most was the chair. A single plastic chair pushed against the wall, blank and waiting. In all my years of working, I had seen that chair occupied by mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, lovers, friends. I had seen hands held across it, tears spilled beside it, laughter shared over paper cups of coffee. I had seen life, and sometimes death, framed by that simple, cheap seat. And now it stood there for me. for someone who might come sit beside me. I kept glancing at it, expecting it to change somehow, to fill with warmth or weight, but it didn't. It stayed empty. I pressed the nurse call button once to ask if I could use the phone. I dialed Greg's number, my hands trembling slightly. It rang, then rang again, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I hung up and stared at the chair. I imagined him walking in, setting down his bag, saying, "Mom, I came as soon as I heard." I imagined him sitting there, reaching for my hand. I imagined his face, older than the picture on my nightstand, but still my boy. I called again the next day. This time, I left a message. I told myself it wasn't urgent. I downplayed it, tried to keep my voice calm. Just wanted to say hello. Hope you're doing well. I didn't mention the collapse. I didn't mention the hospital. I didn't mention the words abnormal cells or biopsy or oncologist. I just said I was thinking of him and hoped to hear back soon. Then I hung up and looked at the chair again. Meals came on trays with foil lids and plastic cutlery. I picked at them without appetite. Nurses came in and out, kind but distracted. Machines beeped rhythmically beside my bed. I watched the sun move across the slats of the blinds, each hour stretching longer than the last. And all the while, the chair waited. Its silence became a presence, not just a void, but a statement. I found myself talking to it, in my head, asking it questions I already knew the answers to. On the third night, a volunteer brought a magazine and a soft smile. She placed the magazine on the table and adjusted the blanket at my feet. She didn't sit. No one did. That evening, I finally asked the nurse if I could move the chair closer. She obliged, maybe thinking it was for my comfort. I dragged it next to my bed and just stared at it. I imagined Peter sitting there. I imagined my mother. I imagined people who once would have come without hesitation. But not Greg. It was strange how that chair began to carry weight, not just of plastic and metal, but of memory and expectation. Every creak of the hallway made my heart lift. Every distant voice made me listen harder. But the door never opened for him. The chair remained mine alone. In some strange way, it became a mirror. It reflected what I no longer had, not just presence, but connection. I thought about all the birthdays I'd remembered, all the Christmas gifts wrapped in careful paper, all the congratulations and consolations I'd offered over the years. I thought about how many times I had dropped everything to be there. And now, here I was, older, vulnerable, and alone. Not in the world. There were still nurses, aides, strangers, but alone in the way that mattered. Alone in the bloodline. When the doctor returned with results, he sat in the chair. It was the first time it held anyone. He explained things gently, clearly. After I came home from the hospital, everything looked the same, but felt different. The house was still neat. The curtains still fluttered in the breeze from the cracked window, and Teddy still waited by the door when I came in, his tail wagging weakly. But something had shifted inside me. I moved slower, not from the physical strain, but from the weight of something quieter, heavier, something that sat behind my ribs and refused to leave. It was the silence that came after the beeping machine stopped, the silence that filled the space between one unanswered call and the next. I didn't unpack my hospital bag for a week. It sat near the door like an unspoken reminder, holding the smell of antiseptic and the shape of folded hospital gowns. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I drifted through the days, tethered to small tasks that gave me structure, watering the plants, checking the mailbox, folding laundry I barely used. The world outside moved forward in full color, but my days blurred into shades of gray. The mornings were the hardest. I would wake up just before dawn, the same way I had for decades, expecting the rhythm of a day that required me. But now there was no work to go to, no patients to greet, no charts to review. Just me, the quiet click of the thermostat, and the soft breathing of Teddy beside my bed. I made tea, always tea. It was the only part of the day that felt reliable. I held the mug like it could anchor me to something solid. I sat by the window most mornings, staring at the street that never changed. A boy on a bike passed by at 8 sharp. The woman with the golden retriever came by at 9:15. The garbage truck rumbled through at noon every Thursday. I watched it all like scenes from a film I had seen too many times. Nothing asked for my participation. I was a viewer now, not a character. I tried calling Greg once more that week. He didn't answer. I left a message. I don't remember exactly what I said. Something light, probably. I didn't tell him about the diagnosis. I didn't want to sound dramatic or desperate. I didn't want to be that mother, the one who guilted her son into visiting. But after I hung up, I stared at the phone and wondered how we had become strangers. I thought about all the times I had held him when he cried, when he had fevers, when he needed comfort. I thought about the boy who used to run to me in the school parking lot, backpack bouncing. Now I couldn't even get a call back. I ate simple meals, toast, soup, apples. I didn't feel hungry much. Some days I forgot if I'd eaten at all. I lost track of time easily, drifting between the kitchen and the porch, sometimes falling asleep in the chair by the fireplace with a blanket pulled to my chin. Teddy stayed close. He didn't ask questions. He just leaned against my legs when I sat down, as if to say, I'm still here. The days melted into each other. I found myself rereading old books not for the story, but for the familiarity. I watched shows I had already seen, letting the noise fill the room so I didn't have to face the silence. I avoided mirrors. I didn't like what they showed me, not because of age or illness, but because of the emptiness in my eyes. They looked like they belonged to someone waiting for something that would never come. I kept a small notebook by my bed. At night, I would jot down things that I had done, as if recording proof that I still existed. Fed Teddy, watered lilies, called pharmacy, drank chamomile. They weren't accomplishments, they were affirmations, pages of small acts that said, I was here today. Sometimes I looked through my jewelry box, not to wear anything, but to remember. Each piece had a memory attached to it, a birthday, an anniversary, a gift from Peter after one of his long work trips. I used to imagine passing them down to Greg's wife someday, to a granddaughter maybe. But those images felt like faded photographs now, corners curling inward. The neighbors checked in once, just a quick knock on the door and a, how are you, that didn't wait for a real answer. I smiled, said I was fine. People liked easy responses. They wanted to feel like they cared without getting pulled into the weight of your grief. I didn't blame them. Everyone had their own burdens. One night, the power flickered out for a few hours during a storm. I lit candles around the house and wrapped myself in Peter's old sweater. The wind howled, branches tapped at the windows, and rain battered the roof. I sat in the dark and listened, not just to the storm, but to the hum of my own thoughts. I realized that I hadn't spoken out loud all day. Not a single word. There was no one to talk to, just me and the sound of my own breath. That night, I dreamed of my childhood home. I walked through it slowly, running my fingers along the wallpaper, smelling my mother's perfume. In the dream, everything was intact, whole. I woke up with tears on my cheeks and the weight of longing pressing down on my chest. It wasn't for the past. It was for the feeling of belonging, of being known, of being needed. The following morning, I stood in the doorway and looked at the sky. It was pale, streaked with soft clouds, the kind of sky that gave no promises. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders and whispered something to Teddy. He wagged his tail. That was enough. It had to be, because the phone didn't ring, and the mailbox was empty, and the days kept coming, quiet, gray, unchanging. It was a Tuesday morning when I finally climbed into the attic. The sky outside was low and gray, the kind that pressed down on the roof and made everything inside feel a little heavier. I hadn't been up there in years. The pull-down ladder creaked as I unfolded it, and the dust rose like smoke when I opened the hatch. The air smelled of insulation and old paper. I stood for a moment, breathing it in, trying to remember the last time I'd climbed those steps. The attic wasn't big, just enough space to crouch and shuffle, low beams forcing me to bend at the waist. Boxes lined the sides like silent witnesses, holiday decorations, photo albums, winter coats sealed in plastic. I moved slowly, careful not to knock anything over. Each box held a version of me I no longer recognized. There was a carton of Greg's school projects, a stack of Peter's vinyl records, and a framed certificate from the hospital thanking me for years of service. None of it felt urgent, but in the far corner, under a faded quilt, was what I had come for. The jewelry box was exactly where I remembered it, wrapped in an old scarf and tucked beneath a cardboard box labeled linens. It wasn't particularly large, about the size of a loaf of bread, but it had weight, not just in its material, but in what it held. It was carved from dark wood, the lid inlaid with a faded floral design I used to trace with my fingers as a girl. It had belonged to my mother, and then to me. I had always imagined passing it down someday, maybe to a granddaughter. That idea had once brought me comfort. Now it just made my hands tremble as I lifted it. I brought it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. The sunlight barely reached through the cloudy window, but it caught on the brass latch, making it glint faintly. I stood for a while before opening it. It felt like disturbing a tomb, not because of anything morbid, but because I knew what was inside represented a life I no longer lived, a life of connection, of celebration, of meaning shared between people. When I finally opened the lid, the familiar scent of old perfume escaped. My mother's, maybe, or mine from decades ago. Inside, everything was where I had last left it, neatly arranged, wrapped in tissue, each piece resting in its designated space. There was the silver bracelet Peter gave me on our 20th anniversary, engraved with our initials, a pair of pearl earrings from my father, the ruby brooch my sister had passed down before she died. There were things I hadn't worn in years, not because I didn't love them, but because there was no occasion anymore, no one to dress up for, no one to notice. I picked up the locket with the photo of Greg as a child. His smile was bright, full of life, the corners of his eyes crinkled in laughter. I remembered the day that picture was taken, at the zoo just after he dropped his ice cream, and I'd bought him another one. That photo lived close to my heart for years. I used to wear that locket when he was away at college. I wore it to his wedding. I hadn't touched it since. I held each piece carefully, as if the memory attached might crumble if I squeezed too hard. I wasn't ready to say goodbye to them, not yet. But I wasn't ready to pretend they had a place in the future either. They had become relics of a world that no longer called my name. The weight of the box wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It represented expectation, mine, and maybe even theirs. I had always thought I would pass these things on to Greg. Maybe his wife would wear the brooch. Maybe their daughter would put on the bracelet at her prom. I had imagined a continuity that now felt naive. The truth was, they didn't ask about these things. They didn't ask about me. I sat there for hours, sorting, remembering, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying without sound. I placed the pieces back into the box one by one, but not in the same order. This time, I arranged them by meaning. What had been given in love, what had been earned, what had survived loss. When I closed the lid, the box felt even heavier, though nothing had changed inside it. I carried it into the living room and set it on the mantel above the fireplace. Not hidden, not forgotten, just there, a quiet monument. I dusted around it gently and stepped back to look at it. It seemed smaller in that room, less grand than it had on the table, but it still pulled at me, as if it were waiting for something. I didn't decide anything that day, but something had shifted. The idea that these items must follow bloodlines no longer seemed sacred. I had given them years of reverence, and in return, they gave me echoes of people who were no longer here. The one person I had left had made himself distant, too distant, and I was tired of pretending the thread still held. Later that evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my usual chair, the box still visible in the corner of my eye. I didn't open it again that night. I didn't need to. I knew what it held, and I knew what I was beginning to feel. I was starting to believe that maybe legacy didn't have to be blood. Maybe it could be choice. Maybe the worth of these things came not from who inherited them, but from what they inspired before they left my hands. The box remained still, but inside me, something began to move, a quiet turning, a decision not yet spoken, but already real. It began with a flyer, a simple piece of paper tucked into my mailbox, folded in half and nearly missed between a grocery store coupon and a political ad. The paper was soft at the edges from the rain, but the ink hadn't run. It was for a local women's shelter, one I had heard of but never visited. They were collecting donations for their annual auction: jewelry, art, keepsakes. Items with a story, the flyer said. Things once loved, ready to love again. I stared at it longer than I should have, sitting at the kitchen table, the morning light barely pushing through the clouds. Something about those words felt like an invitation, not just to give, but to be understood, to be seen as someone who still had something to offer, not forgotten, not passed over, still part of something. I placed the flyer next to my tea and didn't touch it again for hours. But I thought about it. All day, I found myself looking at the jewelry box on the mantel. Every time I passed through the room, it was there like a question waiting to be answered. The weight of it had started to feel less like heritage and more like a burden, a collection of silent promises I no longer believed would be kept. That night, I sat with the box in my lap. I didn't open it, I just held it. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time someone had asked me about the things inside. The last time anyone had shown interest in the stories I'd wrapped around each item. I couldn't remember. They had become museum pieces in a house with no visitors. I thought about the shelter, about the women who had left everything behind, about how starting over meant losing not just things, but the parts of yourself attached to them. Maybe what I had kept so carefully could help someone else feel rooted again. Maybe what had grown dusty with memory could shine again with purpose. The decision came quietly. There was no flash of resolve, no dramatic moment. It just settled over me like a soft blanket. I was ready to let go, not out of bitterness, not out of grief, but out of clarity. Holding on no longer felt like honoring the past. It felt like holding back the future. The next day, I called the number on the flyer. A woman named Janet answered. Her voice was warm, steady, like someone who had spent her life listening more than speaking. I told her I had something I wanted to donate. She didn't ask for details. She just thanked me, genuinely. She asked when I'd like to come by. I said soon. I spent the following afternoon sorting the contents of the box. Not everything would go. There were still a few pieces I wasn't ready to release, small things with threads still tied to my skin. But most of it, I knew it was time. I wrapped each item in soft cloth, the way my mother once showed me, and placed them in a smaller wooden case. As I worked, I spoke their stories in my mind. This one for our 10th anniversary, this one for my first raise, this one when Greg got accepted into college. It felt like preparing someone else's belongings, like I was setting them free. I found a photograph of myself in the box, tucked beneath a bracelet. I must have placed it there years ago. I looked young in it, confident, alive in a way I hadn't felt in some time. I put the photo on my dresser. It didn't belong in a box anymore. The drive to the shelter was quiet. The leaves had started to change color, and the roads were lined with amber and rust. I didn't play the radio. I wanted to hear my thoughts clearly. I parked and sat in the car for a long minute, watching people move in and out of the small building. No one looked broken. No one looked defeated. They just looked like people doing what they could to survive. People who had chosen to keep going. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and something warm, maybe cinnamon. A few volunteers were sorting through donated clothes. Janet met me with that same calm voice and eyes that held more stories than she could ever say aloud. I handed her the case and said thank you before she could. She didn't open it right away. She just held it close and nodded, like she knew. We didn't talk long. I didn't need to explain. She offered me tea. I declined. I left with empty hands, but a strange fullness in my chest, like I had unclenched something that had been tight for years. That night, the mantel felt bare without the box. I kept glancing at it, forgetting it was gone. But I didn't feel regret. I felt space. I felt lightness. I felt like I had done something meaningful, not for legacy, not for appearance, but for truth. I had taken a step out of the shadow of expectation and into a version of myself that no longer waited to be remembered. I had remembered myself, and that was enough. I didn't hear from Greg for several weeks after I donated the jewelry. I hadn't expected to. In truth, I had stopped expecting most things. Expectations had become small traps I built for myself, and I was tired of falling into them. Each day passed quietly, shaped by simple routines: feeding Teddy, watering the plants, brewing tea I barely drank. The house was still, the kind of stillness that didn't comfort but also didn't disturb. Just existence, hour after hour. I began to notice sounds I hadn't paid attention to before. The way the floorboards groaned in the hallway when the temperature changed. The soft tapping of the kitchen faucet when it wasn't shut quite right. The hum of the refrigerator shifting gears in the middle of the night. These became the soundtrack to my solitude, small mechanical reminders that the world moved on, even in silence. Some days I wouldn't say a single word out loud. There was no one to speak to, not even small talk at the store. I had started ordering groceries online, finding it easier than walking the aisles alone. The delivery drivers left bags at the door. I waved through the window, and they waved back. No words exchanged, just gestures, kind but brief. Teddy grew slower, his legs stiff, his naps longer. I watched him closely, gently brushing his fur as he lay beside me on the couch. He was old, He had carried so much of my sorrow without question. I knew he didn't understand what was happening, but somehow he sensed it. When I cried, he nudged his head under my hand. When I stared too long out the window, he climbed into my lap. He was my only witness, my last soft presence. One afternoon, I sat on the back porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the sky turn from gray to amber. The wind stirred the leaves, and the trees whispered to each other in brittle voices. I realized I hadn't listened to music in months. The stereo in the living room sat untouched, a relic like so many other things in the house. I had stopped playing the piano, too. It stood by the wall, its keys covered with a lace cloth, silent and forgotten. Music had once been my comfort, but now even that felt distant, like reaching for a memory that recoiled when I got too close. The mailbox remained mostly empty. Bills, advertisements, nothing personal. I stopped checking it daily. There was something painful about lifting the lid and finding only silence in paper form. Emails, too, mostly promotions or health reminders from the clinic. Nothing with warmth, nothing with care. My phone stayed where I left it, on the kitchen counter, screen dark, charger plugged in out of habit. It rang once, a number I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. I let it ring out into the room, a sound that seemed too loud against the hush I had grown used to. I sometimes wondered what Greg told people about me. Did he say I was fine? That we talked often? Did he mention me at all? I imagined him at a dinner party, someone asking about his parents, and him answering with vague platitudes. She's doing well. We talk when we can. Busy, you know how it is. I imagined him believing his own version, one where absence didn't sting and silence didn't leave bruises. One morning, I received a letter from the clinic. The results were in. I sat at the table, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hand. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I made tea, sliced an apple, and fed Teddy half of it under the table. Then I went to the garden and pulled a few weeds that had crept into the flower bed. When I finally opened the envelope, the words were clinical and concise. Further testing recommended. Options to discuss. Numbers, percentages, appointments. I folded it neatly and placed it on the counter, under the edge of the toaster. I would call them tomorrow, or the next day. The thing that surprised me most was that I wasn't afraid. Not of illness, not of decline, not even of dying. What scared me was the realization that if I disappeared, days might pass before anyone noticed. My absence would not ring out like a bell, but drift like dust, settling silently on forgotten furniture. I had become so used to the quiet that I began to disappear inside of it. I started writing letters, not to send, just to write. To Greg, mostly. Things I wished I could say without bitterness. I told him about the day he was born, about the way his father held him for the first time. I told him how proud I was when he graduated, how I cried quietly in the car so he wouldn't see. I told him about the nights I sat in the hospital watching other families come and go, while the plastic chair in my room remained empty. I didn't accuse, I didn't plead, I just wrote. I placed the letters in a drawer beneath the towels in the hallway linen closet. I didn't expect anyone to find them, but the act of writing was enough. It made me feel real again, like I still had a voice even if no one was listening. At night, I began to sleep with the bedroom door open. I don't know why. Maybe it made the house feel less closed in. Maybe I was hoping that the wind would carry something in. A sound, a sign, a breath of memory. The moonlight spilled onto the floor, silver and soft. I lay in bed, counting the shadows on the ceiling, letting my thoughts drift through rooms and years. The silence no longer felt like an enemy. It became a companion, a steady presence that asked nothing of me. It didn't forget. It didn't disappoint. It just stayed. And for now, that was something I could hold. It was a Thursday morning when the letter arrived. I almost didn't check the mailbox that day. The sky was a dull sheet of gray, and the wind had turned cold again, curling under the hem of my coat as I stepped outside. I hadn't been sleeping well, and my body felt heavy, as if each step pulled me further into the ground. Still, something nudged me forward, habit perhaps, or the faint whisper of curiosity that had not yet fully died inside me. The mailbox creaked as I opened it. Inside were the usual things: a grocery flyer, a postcard from a politician I didn't care to know, a bill from the utility company, and then, tucked between them, an envelope. It was handwritten, the name carefully printed in neat, rounded letters. My name. The return address wasn't familiar, but the handwriting held a warmth that stood out against the cold machinery of everything else. It didn't feel like spam. It didn't feel like obligation. It felt intentional. I held it in my hand as I walked back to the house, turning it over, studying the paper like it might speak before I opened it. Once inside, I set the groceries on the counter and sat down with the envelope. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I took a deep breath and opened it. The letter was from the shelter. It was written by one of the women who had received one of the donated pieces of jewelry. Her name was Elisa. She wrote that she didn't know who I was, not really, but that the brooch had come to her during a time when she felt invisible. She said she had been in the shelter for 2 months, trying to find herself again after fleeing something she couldn't name without shaking. The brooch, she wrote, made her feel remembered, as if someone out there believed she was still worthy of beauty, of history, of kindness. She described how she wore it on her first job interview since leaving her old life, how she stood in front of the mirror and straightened the collar of her coat and pinned the brooch just above her heart. She said she had never owned anything so delicate, so meaningful. She said it made her feel seen, not by the world, not even by the interviewer, but by something deeper, a thread of connection that didn't need explanation, a silent hand on her back, steadying her. She got the job. She wrote that she cried in the parking lot after they shook her hand and told her she'd start Monday. Not because of the job, but because, in that moment, she realized she had survived, that she was still here, and that maybe, just maybe, there was still love left in the world, even from strangers, especially from strangers. At the end of the letter, she thanked me, not just for the gift, but for the message she felt came with it, that her life still mattered, that she hadn't been discarded, that she was worthy of something precious. I read the letter once, then again, and again after that. I didn't cry at first. I sat very still, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. The quiet in the room was no longer the kind that pressed down. It felt soft, like a blanket pulled over the shoulders. I looked around my kitchen, the worn edges of the table, the chipped mug beside me, and felt something shift inside me. A return of something I hadn't felt in years. Meaning. I placed the letter gently on the table and went to the mantel where the jewelry box had once sat. The space was still bare. I hadn't put anything else there. I hadn't needed to. But now it felt like something was finally complete. Like the story the box held had found its next chapter. Later that day, I wrote a letter back to Elisa. I didn't say much, just that I was proud of her, that I believed in her, that her words reached me in ways I hadn't known I needed. I didn't mention my own loneliness or the reasons I had donated the jewelry. I didn't talk about my son or the silence between us. I simply said that her story mattered and that I was honored to be a small part of it. I walked to the mailbox at dusk and dropped the envelope inside. The sky was painted in strokes of pink and gold, the air cool but gentle. Teddy trotted behind me slowly, his paws quiet on the pavement. The world felt lighter, not fixed, not healed, but held together by threads of invisible care, by reminders that kindness was not a performance, but a choice we could make again and again. That night, I lit a candle and sat in my chair, the letter folded beside me. I watched the flame flicker, casting soft shadows on the wall. I thought about Elisa, about second chances, about the way a single gesture could ripple outward and find a life to land in. I thought about how, even in the silence, even in the waiting, something good had found its way forward. I no longer needed to fill the house with noise. That letter had spoken louder than anything else. I started writing again. Not letters this time, just pages, little reflections, half thoughts, lists of what I noticed each day. I kept a small notebook on the kitchen table next to the sugar bowl, and every morning after tea, I would open it and write whatever came to mind. Some entries were just a sentence, others stretched across the page like quiet conversations. I didn't think of it as a journal. It felt more like a place to exist without needing to explain myself. One morning I wrote, "The light was different today." That was it, but it stayed with me all day. The thought of something changing, even something as simple as the angle of sunlight, reminded me that I was still here to notice it. I had lived many years by then, seen decades pass through this same kitchen window, but there was something new about this quiet awareness, something fragile and steady all at once. I wrote about Teddy's breathing, about how he sighed in his sleep, as if carrying a weight even in dreams. I wrote about the smell of old books when I opened the box in the attic. I wrote about the woman in the red coat who always walked past the house on Thursdays, her pace brisk, her expression unreadable. I wondered who she was rushing toward or away from. I didn't try to answer my own questions. I just let them sit on the page like leaves fallen in a still pond. Some days I wrote about Greg, not as a complaint or a wish, but just the facts. Greg called once in April. He said he was tired. Or, "I saw a boy today with Greg's same haircut at age 12. Sometimes I would close the notebook and rest my hand on it, as if the paper could absorb something deeper than ink, something older than grief. I didn't need anyone to read the pages. They weren't meant to last. They weren't meant to teach. They were just mine. They gave shape to the silence, boundaries to the stillness. On the days when I felt like I was dissolving into the furniture, like the house might one day fold over me and forget where I'd gone, those pages pulled me back. They whispered, "You were here. You felt this." One afternoon, as I was dusting the shelves in the living room, I found a photograph tucked behind a vase. It was one I hadn't seen in years, me, Greg, and Peter, sitting on the back steps of the house. Greg was maybe 10. Peter had one arm around me and the other resting on Greg's shoulder. We were laughing. I couldn't remember what at, but it didn't matter. I slid the photo into the notebook between two pages that had no writing on them. It felt like it belonged there, not framed, not on display, but gently held between thoughts. In the last week of October, I began writing shorter entries. Just a few words, carefully chosen. Wore my blue sweater today. Thought of cinnamon toast. Didn't cry this morning. They were like markers, small flags planted in each day, declaring this moment mattered. My body had grown slower, stiffer. I could feel something changing inside me, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet erosion that age brings. I didn't fight it. I let the days unfold without urgency. I began to prepare things, not as a farewell, but as a kindness. I updated documents, labeled boxes, made sure the neighbors had the spare key. I cleaned out drawers, gave away coats, folded the quilt my sister had made me, and placed it at the foot of the bed. The notebook grew thicker. Its pages curled slightly at the corners from use, from the oils in my hands. I didn't always read back over what I'd written, but sometimes I flipped through it, stopping at random to see who I had been that day. Some pages made me smile, others made me pause, stare into the air, and close the book again. One evening, I sat on the porch with the last rays of sun stretching across the sky. Teddy lay at my feet, his head on his paws. I held the notebook in my lap and wrote a sentence I hadn't expected. I am at peace with the quiet. I stared at those words for a long time. They didn't feel like an ending. They felt like a landing, like I had touched down in a place that no longer frightened me. There was still pain, still absence, still the hollow echo of what could have been. But there was also a soft resilience beneath it all, a quiet understanding that life had not passed me by. It had simply asked me to witness it from a different angle, from a place of stillness, from a chair by the window, from a line of ink on a small page. That night, I left the notebook open on the table. The candle beside it flickered gently. The house was silent, but not empty. Not anymore. I had filled it with words, with breath, with memory, and that, I decided, was enough.